Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is the Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to Rome 2 Total War, Strategy Saturday sort of thing, and we're going to be talking a little bit about patch 9 because it had a huge sweeping change to the way balance works in this game, which has some good things and some bad things. I'll go over all the changes with you really quickly. First of all, it's Go Pick Rome, the iconic faction. So one of the biggest changes that they've done is they've made elite units or higher quality units cost way more than comparable other infantry units. So these Sokiai Hastati and these Hastati are actually a little bit cheaper, if I recall, than they used to be. The middle tier units stayed close to the same as what they used to cost, but the top tier units like the Praetorian Guard cost way more than they used to now. So these elite units now cost a huge premium to get that. A part of that cost comes from the fact that they've got this Encourage skill, which now costs way more on units that have it. But as well, even Armored Legionaries cost way more than they used to, costing a big premium for that boost in stats that they get, which makes it difficult to justify getting these elite units when you could instead buy way more of these sort of lower and middle tier units. And these changes are obviously not just Rome and not just infantry. They've also done this to cavalry. They've swapped the prices for bows and slingers, so bows are now cheaper, slings are more expensive. This is because the slingers really just were superior to bows for the most part. Elephants, gigantic price hike, so that's sort of the way that all goes. And these changes happened across all the factions, so if you go across any faction, they've also followed this pattern of the really top tier elites costing way more. They're really cheap spammy units either cost a little bit less or cost similar. And all in all, armies I think are going to be a little bit smaller typically if they try to do what they did in patch 8. So I'm not really sure about the costs of these units, but I get the feeling that this is going to trend armies into being very middle tierish. People are not going to use the really overpriced expensive elite units as often as they use the sort of middle of the road units that have a good quality to them, but also can be taken in large numbers. So I think that that's going to be sort of the more common strategy in this game. One of the other things that they've added in this patch is this bonus versus infantry for sword units. The bonus, sorry, I need to pick a faction that is not barbarians. Let's pick Bactria. They've added in a bonus versus infantry on all melee cavalry, and then bonus versus large, which is bonus versus horses plus elephants on all shock cavalry, so spear cavalry essentially. And what this means is that they've changed up the game to be a little bit more rock, paper, scissors-y. The way it works currently in theory is sword units beat spears, spear units beat shock cavalry beats melee cavalry beats melee infantry. Now there's a flaw in this reasoning. Despite the gigantic bonus that these Bactrian noble horse, for example, get versus infantry, because they're in a unit of 60 and because their baseline melee attack is only 29, melee infantry is actually going to be able to hold their own against them pretty well. And in fact, I've had units of, the legionary cohorts beat units of the much more expensive cavalry that I've come up against in a one-on-one fight. So the theory that those units beat swords doesn't really hold water. Of course, combined charging them with cavalry in the rear and infantry in the front is still going to wipe out sword units very quickly and spear units very quickly as well. It's simply more of the case that infantry now has more of a counter because, let's face it, swords already beat cavalry previous edition. The difference is a little bit less extreme now. It's just that 120-man unit is too much for most cavalry units to chew through in a one-on-one basis unless they get a really good shot cavalry charge off. Now, the other part of this meta change means that even more so shot cavalry is now superior to melee cavalry. Typically, a lot of battles have the same sort of pattern. Cavalry will end up crashing into other cavalry on the opposite side. If you've used shock cavalry and your opponent is using melee cavalry, your shock cavalry is going to be at a slight advantage compared to what it was in patch 8. And they already had an advantage over melee cavalry in patch 8, so that gap has widened a little bit. Which means that you're typically going to see that people are going to take shock cavalry and sword infantry. And the reason for that is sword infantry can do okay if they're charged by cavalry of either sort. And you only need a very small number of very low quality spear infantry now to hold off much more expensive, much more high quality cavalry units as opposed to before where you needed fairly high level spear units to hold off a horde of cavalry. And the reason for this is cavalry got a lot more expensive. Like, on the whole, the cavalry that people were bringing that could crack through spear units, you're not going to be seeing anywhere near as many of those units as you used to. It used to be that I could fill out more than this row and get to about here with these Royal Cataphracts, thereabouts. And you just can't anymore. They cost so much more than they used to that you just have much smaller armies of cavalry spam. So a smaller number of spears is going to be able to hold up the same money value worth of horses that you would be attacked with. And that makes it so that spears, you don't need to have very many of them. You can get away with a few small units of these mercenary hoplites, for instance, or you could take like 4 or 5 of these units of Eastern Spearmen even, or these Persian hoplites, and they will be able to hold against much more expensive cavalry. Even if they won't necessarily beat them, they'll be able to hold them. And I think that that dynamic makes it so that factions that have the better offensive sword units are going to do much better than the factions that rely heavily on spears. So Athens, for example, they rely very heavily on these thorax hoplites and these mercenary veteran hoplites. Both of them got a slight price increase, but at the same time, they're only good at hunting down cavalry. If I see someone playing Athens, I'm probably going to just pick swords no matter what faction I am. So let's say I'm playing as Parthia. If I'm playing as Parthia, because these Parthian swordsmen have this plus 10 bonus versus infantry, their attack value and attack characteristics becomes actually quite decent, and they can actually start cracking through those Athenian units quite effectively for their cost. And since they already cost less, I can take more of them as well. So we're going to end up in a situation where my much larger army of superior infantry are just demolishing the Athenians. So you want to play as a faction. Typically, there are sort of ways to get around problems, as always, like flanking or better tactics or all that, but in the general meta sense, it's going to be the factions that have the strong sword units that are in the middle tier that are going to be excelling. So, for example, Rome is going to be an excellent faction in this patch, much more so than they were before. Factions like the Iceni and other factions like that. Iceni are in an excellent position right now because they can take these chosen sword bands. The Iceni Chosen Sword Band has Headhunt and all that other good stuff, whereas if I were to go to these guys, they don't have Headhunt, and they cost the same, so they're the same unit except for that one fact. So the Iceni have these really excellent Chosen Sword Band units at a decent price. 730 is not too much. They've got decent characteristics and statistics, and instead of having to rely on these extremely hyper-expensive, overpriced elite units like these heroic nobles to provide this encourage bonus, they can actually just sprinkle in a couple druidic nobles to get that same encourage, and they could even enhance them further with chant. So the Iceni are in a pretty good place right now, I feel. And Carthage is in a surprisingly good place right now because these Libyan infantry, they're a middle tier unit. They're previously, if you spammed a lot of Libyan infantry, what happened was like 2 Praetorian Guards per every 3 Libyan infantry is what basically you got. So those 2 Praetorian Guard would easily beat 3 Libyan infantry. Now it's more like 4 Libyan infantry to 2 Praetorian Guard, or 2 to 1, which actually favors the Libyan infantry quite a bit. And you've also got a situation where you can also take these really, really inexpensive late Libyan hoplites. If you look at late Libyan hoplites, look at that. They've got plus 25 versus large. So they're ultra specialized, but they're really, really inexpensive at it. They've got 70 armor. That's huge. These guys are actually a really, really good deal, but only at fighting cavalry. So you just need to have a few of them around your back to block against cavalry. And you can use your Libyan infantry as your main punching unit. So that's sort of the way that I think people are going to be playing now. It's going to be much more one-dimensional, which I think is unfortunate, and it's an aspect of this weapon damage bonus versus infantry. If they didn't have this, I'd be perfectly happy making my line consist of something like these late Carthaginian hoplites who have got decent all-around stats and are very defensive-oriented, which would let me then win the cav fight and then sweep around the back of my enemy's superior sword line with my superior holding capabilities. So now the way it is, that superior holding capability is counteracted by this extra bonus versus infantry, which means that the sword units have not only got the advantage in terms of statistics in offense, but they've got an extra boost to push them over the edge, in my opinion, over the superior defensive characteristics of units like hoplites. So I don't think that hoplite lines really work anymore in the same way that they used to, just because the sort of arms race of extra melee attack from that bonus is a little bit too much. Now, there are certain factions that, unlike Carthage, got much weaker. I feel like Egypt is currently much weaker than it used to be. They relied very, very heavily on their elites, like the Galatian Royal Guard or the Hellenic Royal Guard. Without the ability to sort of spam these units, I feel like Egypt has lost sort of one of their really big strengths. Now, they could theoretically take a couple of these units to bolster up their ranks, but they're bolstering up thorax swordsmen or Thurios spears, and those do not make a strong enough center line, especially now that people I feel are going to emphasize sword units. Now, other armies that really sort of got changed by this in a negative way, I feel like Seleucids are in a worse spot because of it, because they relied very heavily on their sort of elite Silver Shield pikemen and their Hellenic cataphracts. Hellenic cataphracts, huge increase in cost. Elephants, huge increase in cost. And all in all, they're going to end up with much smaller armies. So I think that the Seleucids got very hurt by that as well, since they can no longer rely on those Hellenic cataphracts in the same way they used to. And their armies are going to shrink as a result. Other armies I think that are going to sort of change quite a bit. The barbarian factions as a whole got much worse because of the gigantic increase to the cost, and because armies that have got hoplites have usually got really cheap yet effective hoplites. So let's hop over to Bactria, for instance. Thurios spears, scale thorax hoplites, they're relatively inexpensive. They've got that bonus versus large, but you've also got these eastern spearmen who now have like pretty decent stats all in all. Like most extreme I found so far was Carthage. They're extremely good for their cost. You got militia hoplites and these sort of mercenary Italian spears. All these sorts of units are now a little bit cheaper and feel like they're more effective against that sort of cavalry for their cost, especially Carthage. I feel like that's just ridiculous. 70 armor, 25 for 300 is a really, really good deal. But anyway, let's try putting this all into practice. I've already played a couple of battles. They've all been sort of effective using that army I was talking about, using that sword as your main sort of battle line core, and then sort of moving out with a few spears to protect you from back. And that's about all you really need. So let's show you what that sort of looks like here. Okay, so we can use our, was it Veteran Legionary? No, it's first cohort. To get that encourage, we're just going to have a couple of those guys around our army to spread that sort of joy around. We're going to take 2 units of elephants, and this is literally just going to be a complete rushdown army. We're not going to have any sort of subtlety or intelligence to it. We're just going to take some cheap spears to guard our back against the enemy. And yeah, this is pretty much an army. This is what we're going to be going in with. We've got no shooting. We've got really no cavalry, basically. Our opponent looks like he's going as Pontus. That's fine. Expecting chariots, chariots and pikes and stuff like that. I feel like pikes also got weaker in this patch against things like what I'm taking here, but let's not dwell on that too much. Okay. So something like this, and I feel like this army is just really overwhelming for a lot of people. Let's go ahead and hit start battle. Now, why do I think that this is so effective? Well, like I said, it's because they've done an unequal rock, paper, scissors, essentially. If you were to take, for their cost, pound per pound, an elite cavalry unit, it doesn't really beat a sword unit that's sort of a number of sword units equal to their cost. So you could have like 2 sword units for the price of 1 really good cavalry unit. The sword units are going to win. And that's not the case with spear units. If you take an equal cost sword unit and an equal cost spear unit, the sword unit's still going to win. And that's sort of unbalanced the whole equation. Now, it is still cheaper and more efficient to use spears against cavalry, and combined arms tactics can still beat swords, so spears in the front and cavalry in the back will still also beat swords, so you know they're not invulnerable or anything. But I feel like that they're now countered in a way that the other units are not countered. The other units can be countered simply by shoving a sword unit right down their throat, right up front. And I think that that is going to lead to a lot of armies that have a sort of similar characteristic and feel to this one that I'm fielding here. Because this is an easy way to get a lot of hitting power. I've got a lot of morale. I've got the ability to fend off cavalry. I don't really need cavalry myself because I can swarm around and with my infantry just fine. And just generally, I don't feel like I need to take a balanced army with this. I still will play most of this patch with a balanced one, but I feel like this is sort of what the new metagame is leaning towards. Because other popular strategies from the previous edition are going to be a lot harder to pull. For example, a lot of heavy cavalry, that's just not really as effective anymore. Smaller units of spears, smaller numbers of lesser quality spears are now more effective against those cavalry armies, and shooting is going to be less effective because this medium infantry is now going to become more common since you can't take the elite infantry. It's not that the middle-tier infantry got cheaper, it's just that it's now the only option if you want to have a big old battle line. Where the balls is my enemy here? There he is. Okay, so if we look at our opponent here, like Pontus, they really got dicked over in this patch, because like they've got bronze shields. The bronze shields got a huge hike to their cost because of that Inspire ability, and they don't really deserve to have their price increased by that much, simply because like they don't actually have that good of stats. They just had to pay for that ability because I think that sort of became a formulaic change as opposed to a reasonable change, but whatever. Let's see here. So we're going to do sort of sword unity things. We're going to go around the flanks here. We're going to just sort of work our way around to our opponent, and yeah, we're just going to see what we can do. And like as you can see, we're just rushing straight forward. There's no real subtlety or tactics here. We're going to try and get around his flanks with our elephants here, because if we do that, we'll be able to win pretty easily and decisively, even though apparently you can walk into the front of pike units and beat them now. I don't really know. But anyway, let's get our units all ready to... yeah, let's get our units all ready for a charge.
We have discovered the enemy's hidden units.
So as you can see, his army is much smaller than it used to be just because of the way they've increased the price of those bronze shields. Most specifically is because of the increase to the bronze shields. And because they're so much more expensive now, it's much harder for him to take these sort of armies with this pipeline as well, which I think is partly a good thing. Okay. Actually, no, I want them to continue around. Okay. They're a bit disrupted, but not quite enough for my likings. Okay.
One of our units has gone berserk.
Elephants being berserk, that's fine by me. Let's get these guys away from there, actually. I think those guys are facing the wrong way with those pikes, so we can go in there. And, yeah. We can go in on the side against those guys. Let's get this guy away from there. And, yeah, our opponent left the game, because... I mean, it used to be that you would have a full roster as the Pontic force using this guy, and, like, I'm using much higher quality infantry than he is. I'm using elephants, and, like, there's just not much he can do to stop me at this point in time because of the sheer numbers that I can bring to bear of high quality troops. Not the top quality, but they're still good enough to get the job done, and I think that that's going to be sort of the new thing. Well, anyway, I'm sort of disappointed in the patch. I still am having fun playing the game because, like, it is at least more interesting than it was before, I think. It's less interesting back when people just spammed elephants and heavy cataphracts. Even though I didn't do that, that's what other people are doing against me, and I still beat them most of the time. It was just sort of what people did. Like, I think it is nice in a certain respect that, like, the medium tier troop is now the optimum, because I like that look of, like, good solid infantry in huge numbers. I think that that has the proper appeal and look of the era, and especially if you're playing as Rome. I mean, you want to be using these legionaries, and people just weren't. People were using the Praetorian Guard. And having a big army of legionary cohorts just looks cooler and feels more authentic, even though it isn't. And it feels more like you're leading a Roman army than just some sort of weird, silly thing like it did before. So I think there are good things and I think there are bad things about this patch. The bad thing is I definitely don't think they've balanced the game. I don't think that they've really brought it to a more competitive state, but they've also been willing to show that they're willing to do dramatic overhauls to try and move that way. And what they have done has made this game, I feel, pushed the meta towards something that is much more enjoyable to me because I like these medium infantry units. They're my favorite units in these sorts of games, the ones that are sort of reliable but not elite, the ones that sort of feel like they're a professional soldier without being some sort of weird parody of a berserker movie hero thing. So anyway, I'm enjoying the patch. I do think that it's going to frustrate some people. I do think that certain army compositions are going to fall to the wayside, and I don't like the fact that it sort of pushes real combined arms away a little bit and forces you to almost, I feel, really heavily emphasize these sword units. But all in all, I'm liking this patch, even though that's quite a lot of criticisms against it. But anyway, I hope you found this enjoyable and informative, and as always, I hope to see you all next time.